September 25, 1944. Winston Churchill is inside the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall in London. These underground rooms are where Britain's leaders follow the progress of the war. Churchill is carefully reading and watching the latest reports coming from the Netherlands. The news is worrying. The important bridge at Arnhem is still controlled by German forces. British and Allied troops have been fighting hard, but they have not been able to capture it. The situation is tense, and every update brings more concern. Only a few days earlier, Churchill had supported a bold military plan. The plan promised a fast advance across the Rhine River. If it worked, it could have allowed Allied forces to move deep into Germany and possibly end the war in Western Europe much sooner than expected. At the time, the plan seemed full of hope and confidence. Many believed it could shorten the war and save lives. Now, as Churchill studies the reports in the war room, that hope feels uncertain. The reality on the battlefield is proving far more difficult than planned, and the bridge at Arnhem remains out of reach. Now, the messages and reports reaching London are saying something very different from what Churchill had expected. The news coming from Arnhem is no longer hopeful. Instead of quick success, it shows confusion, delays, and growing problems on the battlefield. What happens during these days at Arnhem does more than just ruin one daring military plan. It becomes an important turning point. It begins to change how Winston Churchill sees and trusts his most famous battlefield commander, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In this video, we will carefully follow how Operation Market Garden actually unfolded. We will look at what Churchill really knew while he was in London, reading reports as they arrived hour by hour. We will also examine how this risky decision affected his thinking. This single gamble played a major role in changing how Churchill judged Montgomery's large, ambitious plans for the rest of the war. But this was not always the case. In 1942, the relationship between Churchill and Montgomery seemed strong and reliable. They worked closely together, shared confidence in each other, and believed they were moving in the same direction. At that time, their partnership appeared solid and full of promise. Britain was still struggling after a series of painful defeats. Morale was low, and confidence in the army had been badly shaken. The war in North Africa was going poorly, and something had to change. At this difficult moment, Winston Churchill made an important decision. He chose to support a commander who was not yet very famous, Bernard Montgomery. Churchill sent Montgomery to North Africa to take control of the badly damaged and exhausted Eighth Army in the Western Desert. When Montgomery arrived, he did not rush into battle. Instead, he began to rebuild the army step by step. He worked carefully and methodically, focusing on discipline, organization, and confidence. He made sure soldiers were properly trained and understood their roles. Montgomery also refused to be pressured into launching a large attack too soon. Even when others wanted quick action, he stood firm. He believed that attacking before the army was ready would only lead to more losses. He waited until he felt the planning, supplies, and training were fully prepared. Only when Montgomery believed the preparations were adequate did he agree to move forward. His careful approach marked a clear change from the past and began to restore strength and confidence to the Eighth Army. This battle was widely seen as the first clear and undeniable British victory on land during the war. For the first time in a long while, Britain felt that it had truly defeated the enemy in a major ground battle. The victory lifted morale at home and within the army. Later, Winston Churchill spoke about how important this moment was. He famously said that before El Alamein, Britain had known no real victory, and after El Alamein, it would know no defeat. By this, he meant that the battle marked a turning point in the war and changed Britain's sense of confidence and belief. This success greatly increased Churchill's trust in Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery's careful planning and patient preparation now seemed fully justified. Churchill saw him as a commander who could deliver results, and his confidence in Montgomery grew stronger than ever after this decisive victory. Before we go any further, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history and important moments from the past. By this time, Montgomery had developed a strong reputation. Many people saw him as a difficult subordinate. He was known for being very direct, sometimes blunt, and extremely confident in his own judgment. He did not hesitate to speak his mind, even when dealing with senior leaders. However, Montgomery was also the man who had delivered a crucial victory at a moment when Britain desperately needed one. That success earned him respect and made him hard to ignore. Because of their strong personalities, Churchill and Montgomery argued often. Their disagreements were frequent and sometimes intense. Montgomery resisted what he believed was political interference in military decisions. He wanted the army to operate without pressure from politicians. On the other hand, Churchill regularly pushed for faster action and more ambitious plans, believing bold moves could shorten the war. This tension between them became a constant feature of their working relationship. Even so, at several major turning points of the war, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and later Normandy, Winston Churchill continued to support Bernard Montgomery in public. This support remained strong even when their private conversations were tense and full of disagreement. Behind closed doors, they often argued, but in front of the public and the Allies, Churchill stood by his commander. By the summer of 1944, however, this working relationship was about to face a new and serious test. After the successful breakout from Normandy and the closing of the Falaise pocket, Allied forces began moving forward at great speed. British, American, and Canadian armies pushed rapidly across France and into Belgium. Within just a few weeks, the front line moved forward by hundreds of kilometers. German forces were retreating quickly and often in confusion. On the large situation maps used by Allied leaders, the advance looked impressive and dramatic. It seemed as if victory was getting closer every day. But while the maps showed fast progress, the reports from the supply and logistics officers told a different story. As the armies moved farther and faster, serious problems began to appear. Supplies struggled to keep up with the advance, and what looked like success on paper was starting to hide a growing and dangerous weakness. Fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement vehicles all had to be brought ashore from the coast. Most supplies were unloaded on beaches or passed through ports that were still too small, badly damaged, or far away from the rapidly moving front lines. This made supplying the advancing armies extremely difficult. By late August, the problem became serious. Some large Allied units were forced to stop moving forward. This was not because German forces had stopped them, but because they simply ran out of petrol. Tanks, trucks, and other vehicles could not move without fuel, no matter how weak the enemy appeared to be. At the same time, the situation on the ground looked full of opportunity. German forces were retreating, and the front seemed open. However, the strain on supply lines was becoming more and more obvious. The Allies now faced a difficult choice. Because of this, Allied leaders began to disagree about the best strategy. Different commanders had different ideas about how to use the limited supplies available. At the center of this debate was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was now serving as the Supreme Allied Commander, and from early September, he also became the overall commander of Allied ground forces in Northwest Europe. With both political pressure and military reality weighing on him, Eisenhower had to decide which plan to support and how to move the war forward.
Eisenhower supported a strategy known as a broad front advance. Under this plan, British, Canadian, and American armies would all move east at the same time, advancing together along a wide front. The idea was to keep steady pressure on the enemy everywhere, even if progress was slower in some areas. Bernard Montgomery strongly disagreed with this approach. He argued for a very different plan. Montgomery believed the Allies should concentrate their strength in one place and strike hard. His idea was to launch one powerful attack through the Netherlands, cross the major rivers, and push straight into Germany. The final goal of this attack was Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. Montgomery believed that if this area could be reached quickly, Germany's ability to continue the war would be badly damaged. To make this plan work, he asked for temporary priority in supplies, especially fuel and transport, so his forces could move faster than the rest. In Montgomery's view, this single, focused thrust could end the war in the West within just a few months. Winston Churchill found this idea appealing. It offered the possibility of a rapid advance into northwest Germany before winter arrived. At the same time, it would place a British-led army group at the center of events during a decisive phase of the campaign. This mattered to Churchill, especially after a period when growing American strength had begun to dominate Allied operations.
By early September, Montgomery's idea had been turned into a detailed and organized military plan. It was given the code name Operation Market Garden. In this plan, the word market referred to the airborne part of the operation. This meant using paratroopers and airdropped troops to seize important objectives ahead of the main army. 3 Allied airborne divisions were chosen for this task. These were the American 101st Airborne Division, the American 82nd Airborne Division, and the British 1st Airborne Division. They were later reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. These airborne forces were to be dropped from the air along a narrow route running from north to south through the Netherlands. Their job was to land behind enemy lines, capture key bridges, and hold them long enough for ground forces to advance and link up with them. The entire plan depended on speed, coordination, and precise timing. If everything worked as planned, the airborne troops would open a clear path for a rapid advance into Germany.
The job of the airborne troops was to capture and hold a series of important bridges over canals and rivers in the Netherlands. Some of the key targets included the Maas River at Grave, the Wall River at Nijmegen, and the Lower Rhine at Arnhem. Holding these bridges was essential because they would allow the main ground forces to move quickly across the rivers without delay. The garden in the plan referred to the ground attack. The British 3X Corps, led by the Guards Armored Division, was responsible for this part. Their task was to drive up a single raised highway that ran from the Belgian border into the Netherlands. The ground forces would move forward through the areas that had already been secured by the American airborne divisions. As they advanced, the troops were supposed to cross each captured bridge in turn. If everything went according to plan, they would reach Arnhem within just a few days. On paper, the operation seemed simple and logical. The airborne forces would secure the river crossings ahead of the ground troops, allowing the main army to advance quickly and link up with them. The plan relied heavily on speed, precise timing, and coordination between the airborne troops and the ground forces. Everything had to work perfectly for it to succeed. The armored forces were planned to move along the only reliable road through the flat Dutch countryside. This road ran over rivers and canals, which were otherwise difficult to cross. Because of this, the highway was the main route for the heavy tanks, trucks, and artillery needed for the advance. If everything went according to plan, the British forces would establish a bridgehead, a secure area on the far side of the rivers. This bridgehead would extend beyond one of Germany's last major natural defensive lines in the west.
In other words, it would give the Allies a strong and important foothold inside enemy territory, allowing them to continue their push into Germany. The success of the entire operation depended on this combination: the airborne troops holding the bridges and the armored forces moving quickly along the single road to link up with them. Any delay or failure along the route could endanger the whole plan. Even though there were serious concerns about the plan, several factors kept these worries from stopping the operation. The Allies had recently achieved important successes on the battlefield, which boosted confidence. There was also a strong desire among leaders and the public for a decisive operation that could push the war closer to an end. On top of that, Montgomery himself was convinced that his plan could work, and he argued for it with confidence and determination. Churchill was briefed on Montgomery's idea and listened to the arguments. He heard that a single, bold operation could capture a crossing of the Rhine in one daring move. The plan promised to put British planning and British troops in the leading role during this critical moment. The idea appealed to Churchill, and he decided to give his support to Montgomery's proposal. Finally, the day came. On Sunday, September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden began. On that morning, large Allied airborne forces descended from the sky over the Netherlands. Paratroopers and glider-borne troops landed behind enemy lines, ready to seize bridges and pave the way for the advancing ground forces. Parachutes floated down from the sky, opening over fields, meadows, and heathland, while gliders landed carefully on open ground along the route that had been planned. The airborne forces were spreading out to secure key positions and prepare for the arrival of the ground troops. Back in London, Winston Churchill began receiving the first reports from the operation. The early news was encouraging in some areas. Bridges near Eindhoven had already been captured, and initial success was reported around Grave. American paratroopers were establishing positions along the main highway, which meant that parts of the plan were going according to schedule. However, the situation at Arnhem was much more complicated. British paratroopers from the 1st Airborne Division had landed west of the town, just as planned, but they quickly ran into serious difficulties. The narrow roads slowed their movement, and scattered German resistance made it hard to advance quickly. What had seemed like a straightforward part of the plan now faced delays, and the paratroopers had to fight to organize themselves while under pressure from the enemy. The smooth progress that had been hoped for was already starting to face real obstacles. As the British paratroopers tried to move toward their objectives, confusion and delays quickly set in. Narrow roads, scattered German resistance, and difficult terrain made it hard for units to stick together or advance as planned. Only one battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to reach the northern end of the main road bridge at Arnhem and establish a defensive position there. This small success was remarkable, but it was isolated. From the very beginning of the battle, radio communications began to fail. Equipment problems and the challenges of the terrain meant that many radios did not work properly. As a result, formations lost contact with each other and with higher headquarters. The messages that did manage to reach London and the main airborne command were often incomplete. They tended to sound more positive than the reality on the ground actually justified. Leaders back in England, including Churchill, were receiving reports that made the situation seem better than it truly was. This created a dangerous gap between perception and reality, even as the battle became increasingly difficult for the troops on the ground. Meanwhile, the British 30 Corps began its advance from the Belgian border, moving north along the only reliable road available. This road was a single raised highway stretching through the Dutch countryside, and it served as the main route for all the ground forces, including tanks, trucks, and artillery. Because there were no alternative roads that could handle such heavy equipment, the entire advance depended on this one highway.
The Corps had to move carefully and steadily, following the timetable of the operation, while also staying in contact with the airborne troops who had landed ahead. Every kilometer of progress along this narrow road was important because it would allow the ground forces to reach the bridges captured by the paratroopers and link up with them. The success of the entire ground operation rested on 30 Corps moving forward efficiently, overcoming any obstacles and keeping the line of advance open.
Damage to the road caused long and frustrating delays for the advancing troops. Sections of the highway had been destroyed or obstructed, forcing vehicles to slow down or find difficult detours. Additional setbacks at key river and canal crossings, such as at Saône, and the slow capture of the Nijmegen bridges also cost valuable time. The original plan, developed in London, had assumed these objectives would be taken more quickly, so every delay put the schedule further behind. Despite these problems, the first reports reaching the cabinet war rooms in London still sounded mostly hopeful. The messages described bridges that had been captured and ground forces that were continuing to move forward, even though resistance from German forces was stronger than expected. However, as the operation continued, it became increasingly clear that the situation was more complicated and serious than the early reports suggested. Delays and unexpected challenges were beginning to affect the timing and coordination of the plan, creating growing risks for the troops on the ground. Gradually, the messages reaching London began to tell a much more serious story. Instead of the early reports that sounded hopeful, the new updates showed that the situation on the ground was worsening. Piece by piece, it became clear that the British 1st Airborne Division had not been able to secure and hold complete control of the Arnhem Bridge. The bridge, which was supposed to be the key objective of the operation, was still under threat from German forces. This was a major problem because the success of the entire operation depended on the airborne troops holding the bridge until the ground forces could arrive. With control of the bridge uncertain, the risks for both the paratroopers and the advancing 30th Corps were growing. The gap between what leaders in London had hoped would happen and what was actually happening on the ground was becoming painfully obvious. Even after some early successes, the advance of the British 3rd Corps was still slowed by the fact that there was only a single road for their movement. This narrow highway made it impossible for the ground forces to reach Arnhem quickly enough to support and relieve the 1st Airborne Division holding the bridge. By the night of September 25th to September 26th, 1944, the situation had become urgent. The airborne troops were still fighting to hold their positions, and the ground forces were struggling to close the distance. Under the cover of poor weather and darkness, movements and operations became even more difficult, adding to the challenges facing the Allied forces. Every delay along that single road mattered, and time was running out for the paratroopers who were isolated at Arnhem. The combination of narrow routes, German resistance, and bad weather was putting the entire operation under serious strain. After days of intense fighting, the Allies had no choice but to organize a withdrawal of the surviving soldiers from the 1st Airborne Division across the Rhine River. Only a portion of the paratroopers were able to escape, and the rest were either killed, captured, or cut off behind enemy lines. For Winston Churchill, the outcome created several serious problems, all connected to each other. From a military point of view, the operation had failed to achieve its main goal, establishing a secure bridgehead across the Lower Rhine. Without control of the bridge at Arnhem, the plan to push into Germany with a rapid, concentrated attack was no longer possible. In addition, the operation had consumed a large amount of valuable resources. Airborne units had suffered heavy losses, ground forces had been tied up for longer than expected, and supplies such as fuel, ammunition, and vehicles had been used at a time when the Allies were already under considerable strain in northwest Europe.
The failure of Market Garden was not just a single setback, it had ripple effects. It affected planning for future operations, the morale of troops, and the way leaders like Churchill would view ambitious plans in the months ahead. Politically, the failure of Operation Market Garden created a delicate situation for Winston Churchill. There was a real risk that critics, both in Britain and abroad, would view the entire effort as an overly ambitious gamble. They could argue that it had cost an entire airborne division while achieving very little in terms of concrete results. Churchill had been a strong supporter of bold initiatives and daring plans. He had backed Montgomery's idea in the belief that a decisive, rapid strike could shorten the war. Now, with the operation having failed, he faced the challenge of explaining the outcome to multiple audiences, the British Parliament, the general public, and Allied leaders. On September 28, 1944, Churchill delivered a major review of the war in the House of Commons. In his speech, he addressed the results of Market Garden directly. He described it as the largest airborne operation ever attempted at that time. By framing it this way, Churchill emphasized the scale and ambition of the plan, highlighting the bravery and effort of the troops involved, even if the ultimate objective had not been fully achieved. The speech was an attempt to maintain confidence at home and abroad, while acknowledging the risks and challenges of such a bold military undertaking. It was a delicate balance between honesty about the setback and recognition of the courage and determination of the Allied forces.
Churchill also praised the efforts of the 1st Airborne Division. He described their conduct as an outstanding feat of arms, recognizing the bravery and determination of the troops under extremely difficult conditions. He acknowledged that the division had suffered very heavy casualties, but he made it clear that their resistance had not been in vain. The paratroopers' actions had slowed German movements, which gave other Allied forces more time to advance. Their efforts had also helped secure important crossings at Nijmegen and contributed to the establishment of a strong Allied bridgehead in that area. In other words, even though the operation had failed to capture Arnhem, it still produced useful results that benefited the broader campaign. In his public statements, Churchill described Market Garden as costly but still valuable. He emphasized that the operation, despite its high price in lives and resources, would hold an important place in British military history as a bold and ambitious attempt. In his private communications, Churchill could speak more frankly, discussing the lessons learned, the limits of the plan, and the challenges that had been encountered. This allowed him to balance public reassurance with careful military and political analysis behind the scenes. In his private correspondence, Churchill's description of the operation was more detailed and nuanced than in public statements. In a telegram to Janmaats pitted October 9, 1944, he defended Market Garden by arguing that it had come close to success. This view was similar to Montgomery's later public claim that the operation had been largely, though not completely, successful, despite the heavy losses suffered by the troops. At the same time, Churchill began to realize the wider consequences of the failure at Arnhem. Without a secure crossing at Arnhem, the fighting in Western Europe would have to continue well into 1945, delaying the final defeat of Germany in the West. Although Montgomery's forces had advanced far into the Netherlands, the lack of control over Arnhem meant that the Allies could not exploit this advance fully. The operation had shown what could be achieved with bold planning and strong leadership, but it had also highlighted the limits of speed, logistics, and coordination in such a complex undertaking. Churchill's reflections during this period combined recognition of the courage and effort of the troops, a measured defense of the operation's near success, and a growing understanding of the strategic challenges that lay ahead. One important problem after Market Garden was that the task of clearing the Scheldt estuary had not been given enough priority. This area was crucial because it controlled access to the port of Antwerp, which had already been captured but could not yet be used efficiently. By late October, the situation had become urgent. Large numbers of Allied ships were waiting offshore, full of supplies that could not be unloaded quickly. At the same time, units at the front were forced to carefully ration their fuel and ammunition because the supply lines were stretched thin. To address this, General Eisenhower gave instructions to Montgomery. He told him to shift the focus of the campaign and commit the necessary resources to clearing the approaches to the Scheldt estuary. This was a difficult task, requiring careful planning and heavy fighting. Most of this challenging campaign was carried out by the 1st Canadian Army, who faced tough terrain, well-defended positions, and the ongoing pressure of supply shortages. It took weeks of effort, but finally, by the end of the month, the port of Antwerp could begin regular operations and start supplying the advancing Allied armies. By November 1944, Winston Churchill was thinking carefully about the wider consequences of Operation Market Garden. He had long been concerned about the problems of shipping and supply, and now he could see a direct connection between the setback at Arnhem, the delays in opening the port of Antwerp, and the resulting bottlenecks in Allied logistics. These challenges affected how quickly supplies could reach the front lines and how efficiently the Allied armies could continue their advance. For Churchill, this made the overall cost of the Market Garden gamble even clearer. Despite the failure at Arnhem, Churchill did not suddenly turn against Montgomery. He still recognized him as one of the most important generals in the war. Montgomery had been central to major victories, from the Battle of El Alamein to the expulsion of Axis forces from North Africa, and he had played a key role in operations across Northwest Europe. In public, Churchill continued to defend Montgomery. He stood by him against criticism from American leaders and against doubts raised at home about how he was conducting the war. Even after Market Garden, Churchill valued Montgomery's skill, experience, and the results he had achieved. He understood that one setback, as serious as it was, did not erase the many successes Montgomery had contributed to the Allied effort. At the same time, the working relationship between Churchill and Montgomery began to change. Earlier in the war, Churchill had often supported Montgomery's arguments for concentrating resources under British control, even when this annoyed Allied partners like the Americans. Churchill valued Montgomery's boldness and his careful planning, and he was willing to give him some flexibility. After the failure at Arnhem, however, things were different. Montgomery once again tried to secure priority for a narrow British-led advance, but this time his requests faced firmer objections. Not only did Eisenhower's headquarters push back, but London also took a more cautious approach. Leaders there were now more focused on maintaining a balanced strategy among all Allied nations, rather than favoring a single British-led plan. The differences between Churchill and Montgomery did not disappear when the fighting ended. Their relationship remained professional, but the events at Arnhem had shifted the balance. Churchill still respected Montgomery, but he became more cautious about supporting bold, high-risk operations that focused heavily on British forces at the expense of Allied coordination. In the late 1940s, Bernard Montgomery began to write and speak more often about political and defense issues. He commented on topics like conscription and other matters of national policy, stepping beyond the purely military role he had held during the war. Winston Churchill's private responses to Montgomery's opinions were sharper and more critical than what he said in public. In one note from 1947, written in response to a letter from Montgomery about defense policy, Churchill advised the Field Marshal to stay out of day-to-day politics. He suggested that Montgomery's strengths were in military leadership, not political debate, and implied that some of the recent behavior and opinions Montgomery had expressed were difficult to justify. By this stage, however, Montgomery was still widely respected. The commander who had been indispensable in 1942 and 1943 and highly influential during 1944 remained a figure of authority and achievement.
Even though Churchill privately critiqued him, the general's wartime accomplishments and leadership continued to command recognition and esteem.
By this time, Montgomery no longer enjoyed quite the same degree of personal confidence from Winston Churchill as he had during the height of the war. The setbacks at Arnhem and the challenges of coordinating Allied operations had made Churchill more cautious in his support of bold, high-risk plans. Even so, Churchill did not withdraw his public recognition of Montgomery's achievements. In speeches, memoirs, and recollections from those who knew him, it is clear that Churchill continued to speak highly of Montgomery's contributions to victory. He consistently presented Montgomery abroad as one of Britain's most important military leaders, showing that respect and recognition for his wartime service remained strong. The relationship between them had changed, but the trust was modified rather than completely lost. Churchill still valued Montgomery's military judgment, but his proposals were now weighed more carefully against broader considerations, such as supply and logistics, the coordination of Allied forces, and coalition politics. Boldness alone was no longer enough to gain Churchill's full backing. Plans had to balance ambition with practicality and the realities of working within a multinational alliance.
In Arnhem itself, the main road bridge over the Rhine is now named after Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, the officer whose battalion held the northern end of the bridge during the early stages of the battle. His troops' bravery and determination made a lasting impression, even though they were ultimately isolated from the main Allied forces. The current bridge is a post-war structure built on the same site. The original bridge was destroyed by Allied bombing on October 7, 1944, in order to prevent German forces from using it. Despite the destruction of the original bridge, the location and its history continue to serve as an important symbol of courage and resistance during Operation Market Garden. For historians looking back at Winston Churchill's leadership during the war, Arnhem represents a turning point in his relationship with Montgomery. After the battle, Churchill's support for Montgomery became more conditional. He still respected Montgomery's abilities and achievements, but he now weighed proposals more carefully against the practical realities of logistics, coalition politics, and the limits of bold planning. The lessons of Arnhem reinforced the idea that even brilliant commanders and daring plans could fail if the risks were not carefully managed. It showed how complex coalition warfare required careful coordination, and how Churchill's judgment of Montgomery and of bold operations more generally was shaped by both past successes and hard-earned lessons from failure.